Hello students. Today I'm going to give you an audio overview of the progressive movement. Here's some three important bullet points here. First, it says the progressive movement was a period of rapid social, cultural, economic, racial, religious, and political change in American society from 1890 to 1920. Now that's a mouthful to say, but there was a lot of changes to a lot of things in their society to make people's lives better, because we had a lot of problems in our society that need to be addressed and corrected. And the second point says there were a lot of problems in the United States, like a lot of poor people, you had economic hardships, people not making enough money, people not making enough money to feed their family, to clothe them, to give them shelter. So it was a struggle for many Americans and immigrants. And you still had discrimination towards immigrants, minorities, women, children, and industrial workers. A lot of the Irish and Chinese and Mexican and Italian Americans, when they immigrated here, they worked in factories, they worked in railroads, the textile industry, coal mines, and they were mistreated. They were not treated fairly in regards to pay and benefits. And you still had racial discrimination and racial violence towards African Americans in the North and in the South. So those are problems that need to be addressed by this progressive movement. And the word progressive means to improve, to get better, to change from bad to worse, bad to better. Yet many leaders and writers and authors and politicians and civil rights activists and smart people, environmentalists who wanted to make changes to make people's lives better. So you have a better house to live in, better pay, treated fairly, treated equally, get the right to vote, those good things. Here's a page of influential leaders of the progressive movement. I'm not going to ask you to memorize all these people. I'm just going to give you a good brief overview of who these people are. Some of these people you see on this page are familiar because we either talked about them in previous lessons, or you've heard about them from prior knowledge or other history classes you had before 6th grade. And you had women who played a big role. I'm going to talk about them first because ladies first. This lady right here is Jane Addams. We talked about her and her setting up the settlement house, who provided aid to poor people and immigrants to help them adapt to American life, teach them how to read, write, arithmetic, have a place to play games and learn skills and trade. And that's why she was important. This lady right here next to her, her name is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and she played a role in the women's suffrage movement. The word suffrage means the right to vote, and women didn't have the right to vote around this time, but they gained the right to vote. This lady right here, her name is Ida B. Wells, and she was a journalist and writer and teacher who wrote articles in journals speaking out against racism and segregation and discrimination and lynching towards African Americans. And you still had racial prejudice, even though African Americans were free from slavery. And she spoke out against this, and she pushed Congress to pass anti-lynching laws. And she also played a role in the Niagara movement and in forming the NAACP. This lady right here, she's on the dollar bill coin. Her name is Susan B. Anthony. She was a trailblazer. She was awesome. She was a go-getter. She was brave. She even dressed up like a man in order to vote in an election. She was arrested and she was later fined to pay $1, and she never had to pay it. So Susan B. Anthony was a trailblazer. She was a go-getter woman, and she fought hard with Elizabeth Cady Stanton for equal rights for women, particularly the right to vote. And she never lived to see the 19th Amendment passed, which gives women the right to vote. These gentlemen down here, we've talked about them before, W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. They had different viewpoints, and they were influential leaders in the African American community. They both stressed equality for African Americans, and their approach to fighting segregation were different. And I'm not going into detail about that because we talked about them. This gentleman right here, his name is Eugene Debs, and he was a leader of the socialist movement in the United States. He also was a laborer, and laborer is a person who works and pushes for workers have better pay, safer working conditions, and having short hours, and having the ability to spend time with their family and not working all the time, because long hours was a negative effect of industrializations. And the bosses and captains of industry, they didn't care. They didn't care how you felt. They didn't really care about your safety or your well-being. Well, most of them, because all they cared about was profit. So you had people like Mr. Debs who formed organizations to fight against that so workers could be treated fairly. And we have benefits that help us today that came from this time period. This gentleman right here is named Samuel Gompers. That's kind of a funny name. He founded the AFL, which is the American Federation of Labor, in 1890. That was the first major labor union found in the United States. We'll talk more about labor unions later. This gentleman right here, his name is Jacob Riis, and he was a Danish immigrant, which means that he was from the country, a small country in Europe called the Netherlands. And he immigrated to the United States when he was young, and he became an American, and he lived in New York City. And he was a great journalist, and he was a writer. One of his famous books that he wrote was called How the Other Half Lives. And I think I forgot to tell you that he was a photographer. And what he did was he went around the slums of New York, and he took pictures of tenements. And we talked about what tenements were. So he wanted to get people's attention to see how poor people and immigrants were living. Like, it's not all hunky-dory for immigrants coming to America. Some of them don't have enough food to eat. Some of them have apartments that are cramped, that can catch on fire. They have sewage and garbage in their neighborhoods. And we need to fix this problem. We need to make America great for everybody. And it's not all hunky-dory and all roses for immigrants and poor people. So Mr. Riis exposed that in his books and his writings and his photography. That, hey, you know what? We need to make some changes in our city, in our state, and in our country as a whole. So these are some very influential leaders of the progressive movement. There are many people that we could talk about. These are some people I just decided to pick out because I believe that they created the most change in order to make our country great and move in the right direction back in that time period. Here's some progressive U.S. presidents, and they played a big role in making sure people who work in industries and factories are treated fairly, and make sure businesses aren't too greedy and not paying their workers a fair share, and keeping them from getting good salaries so they can take care of their families and buy clothes, food, and other products so they can sustain a good, healthy life. And so these presidents right here really push for laws to make our life better in America, to push for things that are better and to improve. And remember, the word progressive means to improve, to get better. And you have three major progressive U.S. presidents from 1890 to 1920. So it's after the Civil War, and it's a little bit after World War I. You have Theodore Roosevelt. His nickname was Teddy, and he has an awesome story. He's one of my favorite presidents, and he was the president from 1901 to 1909. He was the 26th president, and the teddy bear was named after him. There's an awesome story about Teddy Roosevelt and how he got that name, and I'm going to tell you about that later when we talk about the Spanish-American War and the Roosevelt's corollary. This is Howard Taft. He was the 27th president of the United States. He was the heaviest president. He weighed like 350 pounds. And there's a funny story about Howard Taft. He got stuck in the White House bathtub, and they had to put butter on him, oil on him to get him out the bathtub. And that's a funny story about him. He was a one-term president, and he played a big role in pushing for reforms to make life better for immigrants and people who worked in industries, and I think he supported women's suffrage as well. He was also a Supreme Court justice. U.S. Supreme Court justice. I think he's the only president to be a president and serve on the Supreme Court. So big old Howard Taft. Then you got Woodrow Wilson, and he was called the schoolmaster in politics. He's very intelligent, and he served from 1913 to 1921. He was from Stanton, Virginia. He was the 28th president, and he pushed for laws and reforms that protect our money. The Federal Reserve Bank, he signed that into law, and he was a big supporter of women's suffrage, and he was the president that led us during World War I. And even though he tried to keep us out of war at that time, he couldn't do that because Germany sunk our submarines, and they attacked their allies like Great Britain and France, and he had to respond to that. And so these are the three progressive presidents in U.S. history. And we'll talk more about them in detail later. You're going to have to do some type of assignment on them later on. This page talks about progressive movement and workplace reforms. And I'm going to fill this in for you. There's some factors here that were workplace reforms. This means in factories, in mills, in plants, things that makes workers' lives better. There was an improvement in safety conditions, safety equipment, because it was hazardous in many of these steel plants and textile mills and coal mines. So reformers pushed for laws to make life safer for a worker so they won't get sick and die or get injured. They pushed for reduced work hours and placed restrictions on child labor. There was also a rise of organized labor, and a labor union is an organization of workers of the same trade who fight and bargain with employers like the management and boss for better pay, better benefits, better safety working conditions. And I gave you an example of the Triangular Shirtwaist Factory that burned down in New York in the 1900s. Over 130 women were killed. And now, because of these progressive workplace reforms, that's why we have fire drills. That's why we have fire exits. That's why I have lockdown drills. That's why we have tornado drills. That's why we have it where if you get hurt on the job because of something in the plant that was dangerous or where you work that was dangerous, your boss has to pay you money. You can take them to court. You can sue them. So when you miss work, you can get money to take care of yourself and your family because it's their fault, because they need to provide a safe environment for you. And formation of unions, I already talked about that. The AFL, American Federation of Labor, that was founded in 1890. That was the first labor union in the United States. They merged with the AFL-CIO. That's what it's called today, AFL-CIO. And other things about the progressive movement and workplace reforms was the aftermath of, trying to get my slide to work here, the Homestead Strike in 1892. So that's part one of the progressive movement. Feel free to go back and listen to the audio again if you don't understand or you need to answer questions. All right, thank you for listening, and get ready for part two later on. Peace.